Hi everyone, so today we're going to talk about how to write a proper APA style research report. Okay, so first let's take a look at everything that we're going to discuss in this video. So we're going to go over what goes into an abstract, the introduction section, the method section, the results section of a paper, the discussion section, the references, and the appendices. So let's start out with the abstract, of course. Even though that's the first thing I'm going to talk about, it actually usually is the last thing that you write once you've actually written your entire paper. An abstract typically runs 150 to 250 words. Every journal sets different criteria, so you will actually see abstracts of different lengths, so always make sure that you read the guidelines. For our class, I will use the cutoff that they describe in the book, which is 150 to 250 words. So the abstract typically gives the reader an idea of what the study was all about. So it should provide the reader with just enough information to decide whether or not the article is appropriate. And you all had to do this when you were looking for the literature, right? You looked for articles that would be relevant for you, and the best way to do this is to read the abstracts. So typically an abstract includes what you studied, your primary hypotheses, participants and procedure used. Obviously you can only describe it very briefly. Then just in one sentence or two sentences, the pattern of results that you found. And then lastly, what the implications are of your findings. So it's very short. You need to be very succinct and just give the reader an idea of what the study was all about. So for the body of your actual paper, the first thing, of course, is your introduction section. So an introduction section is somewhat similar to almost a literature review that you've probably done for other classes. So in the introduction section, you always want to make sure that you're first stating what the problem under study is. Typically you start out with a broad statement, and then you actually say specifically what you looked at for this particular research project. So to give you an example, right, you might say something about, this paper looks at if language influences perception. Specifically, if one language has a specific term for one color and another language does not have any terms for that color, will speakers of the two languages perceive the color differently? So you always want to start out with a broader statement and then narrow it down to let the reader know specifically what you focused on. One aspect that's really important of an introduction section is you want to tell the reader why this topic is actually important, right? Why do we care to study this topic? This might be where you might cite some statistics of why something is important. Why do we need to learn more about something, and just put it in context? So putting it in context sometimes is part of why is it important, but it also makes clear to the reader, for the above mentioned example, for instance, are we looking at cultural effects, or are we looking at it from a visual perspective? So what is the area of psychology that you're focusing on? All of that would have to go in your introduction, probably within the first paragraph. And then to follow that is typically a literature review. So you actually have looked at all the literature that there is in the field, ideally, and then you talk about and organize the information in a way that makes sense for your particular paper. So you always want to set this up so it actually eventually leads to your research question. So you might decide to organize it based on different opinions in the field. Maybe there's 2 or 3 different theories about why behavior happens, so you would organize it according to that, or you could organize it according to different methodologies that they use to study a particular topic. You can talk about different aspects. If gender is one thing to consider, you can talk about that first. Next, you talk about self-esteem, and then next you talk about another critical component of the research that needs to be looked at. So it really is something, this is the hardest part really, right? To organize the articles that you read for your study and present them in a way that makes sense and actually makes an argument for why you actually conducted the study that you conducted. So it should all lead up to your research question. And then at the very end of your introduction section, and in some cases, you actually see this even at the beginning of the method section already, but typically it's done at the end of the intro. You see that the authors give you a rationale for the study that they're conducting and also the hypotheses of their study. So you give like a little overview of what your study is going to be all about. You give your hypotheses, what are the possible outcomes. So if there's two theories that could be true, you list those here. As you can see here, it says it's possible that experience influences color perception, but another possibility is that perception is solely based on the visual system. And then last but not least, you also include some predictions for your results. So basically saying what you expect to find. That's usually how the introduction section stops and ends. Next, you're going to transition to your method section. One thing that you should keep in mind when writing your method section is that in your method section, you should include enough information so other people could actually replicate your study. So ideally, you would want to give an overview of your study. You would want to describe your participants. So you actually have a separate section for participants. You talk about the number of participants you ran, how you recruited them, and then kind of some demographic information about the population that you use. So, for instance, age, sex, ethnicity, other variables that you asked about in your demographic questionnaire in your study. Then also you have to describe what equipment you used, if you used any. So that might not be always appropriate if you didn't use any specific equipment. But for instance, for my research, I always talk about the kinds of computers I used, the program that we used, things like that. So if somebody were to replicate the study, they would know exactly what to get or what to build for an apparatus. Next, you're going to talk about the procedure that you used. So typically you actually give a temporal sequence of how you administered the study, what order did you actually give the pieces of information if there's multiple pieces. This is also where you talk about how your independent variables were manipulated or measured in some cases. And then also you mention what was your control procedure, for instance, that you randomly assigned people to one of the three conditions and so forth. And then if appropriate, if you used standardized surveys, for instance, you have to cite your scales in the material section. If you actually made your own materials, you have to have a separate section where you actually talk about what the materials were, what they consisted of, possibly how you normed them. So all the information that somebody would need to really understand what you used as your materials. All right, moving on to the results section. In your results section, you just basically lay out what you found. Typically, there's no explanation yet of what the results mean, although sometimes you kind of see results and discussion combined in some papers, but that depends on the standards for each journal. But typically you do the results and discussion separately, so that's how I'm going to talk about it. So for a pure results section, you basically describe your analysis, so you state what the alpha level is that you used. You also briefly say what kind of a design you used. So for instance, you used a 2x2 ANOVA or a regression analysis or a repeated measures t-test. If there was any scoring or coding that went on, you have to explain how you did that and justify it. And then you typically only report significant results. So anything that had an alpha level of less than 0.05, if that was your alpha level, you would report here. Anything that was actually not significant, you typically don't report in the results section. Sometimes you see that people report marginally significant results, so it's slightly above 0.05. But that's only appropriate in some fields. Also important in the results section is where you also would include some tables and figures if appropriate. So sometimes you see bar graphs with error bars or tables or line graphs. It really depends on what kind of analysis you did. That would, maybe justify using a table or figure. It's not always necessary. One thing that's really important to note is that you should not repeat the data in more than one place, meaning that you should either report it in the narrative or you should actually put it in a table and refer to the table or figure in your narrative. But you shouldn't do both because that would be redundant. Okay, so one other thing that I want to quickly look at is how you actually report your p-values. So at the beginning of the results section, you usually state what was your criterion that you set, either setting your alpha level at 0.05, which is the standard, or possibly at 0.01 if you want to be more stringent and really make sure that you're not committing a type 1 error. So you would state that at the beginning of your results section. In the last couple of years, it's really become more common to actually report an exact p-value that you get from your SPSS output, rather than actually just saying it was less than 0.05 or less than 0.01. So I highlighted this in blue. For the results section, for the results that are significant that you are reporting, you want to make sure that you report an exact p-value. That's what most journals and APA style requires nowadays. Okay, and then we move on to the last part of the body of your paper, which is the discussion section. So in the discussion section, you should take really the first paragraph and briefly summarize the results and discuss the implications of the findings. So this would be really the first time that you're saying, what do the results that I, basically laid out in the results section, what do they mean, right? What are the implications? So you actually put it in words rather than using statistical terms. And then in the paragraphs to follow, really you try to relate the results that you found to previous research and talk about, how does this move the field forward? How does it fit with what's been found before? And then also kind of look to what to do in the future. So the first thing I would always do is look at your results and see how does it compare to other research findings on that topic. Is it consistent with previous findings? Why or why not? And then explain it and relate it to those previous research articles, and of course bringing those back in from the intro. In some cases, right, you find something that's a little bit unexpected, so you would actually mention articles that you didn't necessarily mention in the introduction section. And then really making sure that you make a case for yourself of, let's say you didn't actually find results that were consistent with previous research, really explaining and breaking down why maybe your results were different. It could be that you used a different and a new methodology. It could be that your operational definition was a little bit different. So really explaining why you think that you found the results that you found, and thinking about how do I really explain this to the reader, so it moves the field forward. And then also, usually at the very end, probably the last or second to last paragraph, you would discuss some of the limitations of the study, meaning that you point out some of the flaws or maybe things that you would have done differently if you were to do the study again. Now, I want to caution you here because I don't want you to basically negate everything that you have done in this section. So this should be something where you would mention, you could, for instance, say that, you had fewer male than female students. And obviously that might limit your ability to generalize the results. But so you always want to kind of say something at the end of why your results are still valid. So make sure that whatever limitation you mention, right, you want to be honest about it, but you also want to make sure that you're not basically discredit your own findings. So it's nice to mention some of the limitations, but you don't want to do it in a way that, completely negates what you found. And then last but not least, this can either be done in the same paragraph as talking about the limitations or a separate paragraph, but you should always say something about what research needs to address next in this area. So something maybe that came out of your study that you would like to look at more in the future, or that you think other researchers should look at. Anything like that should be mentioned in the discussion section at the very end. And this is, by the way, also the place where I said, you can get inspiration for future research from other researchers. So finding research ideas is sometimes something that you can do from looking at other people's paper, because they typically talk about what future research should look at. And then, of course, also for an APA style paper, you want to include a reference list. So you must always give credit when credit is due throughout your paper, right? Always citing your sources, giving credit to the people that did the previous research. But then at the end, you want to list the full citation in APA style. So you should only include sources that you actually cite within the text, and you should make sure that you don't actually have any in-text citations that are omitted in the reference section at the end. So you need to be really thorough about that and make sure they're all indented and follow proper APA style. And then also you might have several appendices. In the appendix, you would usually put information such as materials used in your study. So you would put all your study materials, such as surveys used or materials used, sample stimuli, right? Maybe pictures that you used for your study. Anything like that should really go in the appendix. So for you, for instance, it would be appropriate to really include the materials that you submitted as your study materials. Okay, and then just a few things about writing style. So of course you want to be very precise and succinct in your writing, making sure that you're communicating your ideas really well. Really make sure that you consider your audience. Typically, right, these papers are written for experts in the field, so you can use the jargon that's appropriate. It should be coherent and it should be organized in a way that makes sense to people. And just basically general rules of good writing apply, making sure that each paragraph contains a topic sentence, so I can read the first sentence and know what the paragraph is going to be all about. And then, of course, proofread. And I would really suggest that you go to the writing center, have somebody else look at it to make sure that there's no typos in there, because obviously that is something that would interfere with your ability to communicate to your audience. And I already touched on this a little bit, but you always want to give credit when credit is due. Make sure that you're separating your own words from other people's ideas, so you need to cite the sources. I would really like you to minimize the use of quotation marks around things. You should put things in your own words as much as possible. But you make sure that every time you summarize something in your own words, that you still put the citation of a paper at the end of the sentence, and make sure that you give the people credit that actually came up with this idea. Very important, because if you don't do that, that's considered plagiarism. Again, something about good writing style: you should use active versus passive voice. So refer to yourself as the experimenter. Don't use, I did this or we did this. Try to use active voice whenever possible. And just kind of applying general writing rules that would apply even to any other paper, and even in an English class. Also, AP is very committed to really avoid biased language. So some examples would be just being really sensitive about the language that you use. So it should be gender neutral, using things like firefighter rather than fireman. Be very careful about the labels that you use. Look at the literature, see what other people have called it. Make sure that you use the politically correct term. Try not to assign labels. For instance, you should avoid saying things like we tested groups of autistics and normals by indicating that they're abnormal. Instead, maybe you could say something like we tested people with autism and without autism. So you want to make sure that you kind of use the right terminology. Okay, and then also, as I've been mentioning throughout this presentation, you always want to refer to the APA manual for some sample papers, making sure that you use correct APA citations, making sure that you use the correct formatting. There's some example papers that break everything down again too. I think looking at examples and even the literature that you've read for your projects will be really helpful in that. All right, that was it for today.